Welcome, wanderer of mystery's crescent moon. Tonight, let us drift beyond the veil of time, into a realm where ancient symbols breathe and whisper forgotten truths. Here, the Ankh, the Uroboros, and the Eye of Horus are not mere carvings upon stone, they are living echoes from the dawn of existence, each carrying a heartbeat older than the stars. In this timeless journey, we will walk with Neferu, Meru, and a nameless wanderer, through deserts that remember footsteps, valleys that guard the silence of centuries, and gateways that bend the very memory of reality. Each step will peel away the dust of ages, revealing not just the meanings hidden within these symbols, but the intertwined fates they command. So still your mind, open your senses, and prepare to travel to the threshold where names and shapes are born together. Milky Way, once you cross, you may never see the world the same again. But perhaps, that is the gift these symbols have guarded for millennia. The night was velvet, and the desert was silent as if time had drawn its last breath. In the darkness, a caravan walked slowly under the starry sky, carrying flickering oil lamps and wooden chests wrapped in jute ropes. Leading the way was a woman with an indigo veil, her eyes tilted like two crescent moons. Her name was Neferu, the Oathkeeper of the Sands. At her side, an ivory dagger carved with a snake biting its own tail, Uroboros, slept in the oil light, shimmering like a metal circle. In the last wooden chest, there was a small amulet of green stone, a cross with a handle, Ankh. And near Neferu's heart, in a cloth pouch, was a thin piece of ivory carved with a wide-open eye, the Eye of Horus, which she never showed. The caravan stopped when the wind changed direction. In the distance, a strip of black stone rose like the back of an ancient beast. Below, it was said, was a descent into a city that had disappeared from maps and memory. The old shaman of the party, called Meru, placed his hand on the sand, settling the lingering heat of the day. He said softly, "The heart of the sand is asleep. Therefore, the call will be heard." He set up a stake, tied a yellow silk ribbon to it, and blew 3 times. The wind gathered into a whistle, drifted into the crevices of the rocks, and was gone. The lamps swayed as if bowing their heads. Neferu watched the blackness of the rock, silent as one listening to a story. She had heard her grandfather tell her that before the rivers, before they had names, there were 3 signs born with the first darkness of the universe. The first was the key with a handle, the Ankh, which opened every door where breath was given. The second was the serpent eating its tail, Uroboros, which kept every story from breaking. The third was the Eye of Horus, which saw what the night wished to hide and the day wished to forget. Whoever understood these 3 signs would never be lost even if the desert shifted its place. "I will go down," Neferu said, her voice like a thread touching the water. Meru nodded, and the chest-bearers tied ropes around the pillars. They followed the ravine, 1 step, 2, 3, until the heat became the smell of burnt cinnamon bark, and the cold from the damp stone breathed the smell of rusty copper. There were scribbles on the wall, rows of bird-headed men with walking sticks, star-studded boats, upturned hands carrying pitchers. Between the scribbles, 3 figures floated back and forth in the light, a cross with a handle, a round snake, an open eye. Neferu touched the wall. She heard the stone whisper like women weaving mats, "Tell me about breathing." She pulled out the Ankh, her fingers hidden in the loop. The talisman was cool. Meru murmured syllables older than words. And the stone moved like a dolphin slicing the surface of the sea. A door opened, without a creak, only the wind suddenly blew back from inside as if there were a separate sky beneath. Behind the door, a great hall. The vaulted ceiling was studded with pieces of night-black plaster, dotted with mica as clear as stars. In the center of the hall, a stone pedestal in the shape of a boat. On the prow, a mother of pearl stared into the depths of the hall. Along the side of the boat was a strip of carvings, a snake coiled around itself, beginning and ending at itself, its body covered with hair-thin letters. Meru said, "This is the silent boat. Whoever boards it will hear the words of things without mouths." He touched the side of the boat, the snake trembled slightly. Neferu stepped forward and placed the Ankh in the recessed cavity at the prow. Immediately, the pedestal shuddered. As if a heart had not been beating for a long time. The eye on the prow glowed slowly and patiently. The people stood as still as trees, with only one sound echoing around them, the sound of water without a source. "What do you want to hear?" Meru asked. "I want to know what the ancient signs say about life," Neferu replied. "Then I will call upon the breath," he said, and placed 2 fingers on the Ankh's loop, half closing his eyes as if measuring the distance between 2 dreams. There was no incantation, only a long, thick silence. Then from the bottom of the boat, a thin mist of air emerged, weaving the shape of a woman crowned with ostrich feathers, holding the Ankh in her right hand, and a whip and hook in her left. She looked at Neferu. Neferu did not kneel, nor did she speak, she waited. "I am the breath of the name," the figure said, the voice like wine through the throat of a reed. "I opened the first door when the mud rose to embrace the newborn sun. I knew men before their names knew themselves. I am the taste of milk on the lips of a child and the last sigh of an old man. From my loop, those who enter the darkness still carry a way out." "You are Ankh," Neferu whispered, "not to call, but to keep the words from slipping away, and my loop not only opens life," the figure said, drawing a silent circle in the air, "but joins the fragments of the world together into a single door." Meru looked around, then leaned toward the Uroboros engraving. "And the story of the snake loop?" he asked soundlessly. As if asking the shadow of the question, "I hear," the silent boat replied in a wordless echo, and the snake on the hull opened its eyes slightly. It released its tail from its mouth, revealing a small opening like the edge of paper. From that opening, a thread of light rolled out, crawling along its body, drawing characters that no one in the group had ever seen, but all understood. It was the voice of time before it chose a direction to flow. "I am a wound that sews itself up. I am the promise that nothing ever dies, only temporarily changes clothes and names. I eat myself to have myself. I am the way home for all circles." Neferu held her finger close to the snake's body without touching it. She saw the seasons change like leaves, saw cities spring up like mushrooms and then dissolve like foam. Each time something dissolved, the dissolved part returned as a shell for the next. She wanted to ask, "Does the circle ever tire?" But she kept silent. The silence was strangely audible. "Yes," Uroboros answered, and the answer was an image, the sun sinking into a shallow pool, suddenly falling bottomless. When the circle forgets its tail, the line breaks. When the line breaks, the name is lost. Neferu looked at the eye on the prow of the boat. The eye did not blink. She knew there was another mark, the last to be named. For it was both concealing and revealing, the Eye of Horus, the eye that had broken into 6 pieces to measure time, to measure perfume, to count grain, to divide portions among the living, to measure the sea, to weigh oaths. She touched her pocket, and heard the thin ivory sliver move like a fish in a cloth bag. "Do you see me?" she said, still in the whisper of someone who heard herself. The answer came in the form of a light from the vaulted ceiling, descending like a thread of water. The light hung suspended, forming an eye, its pupil as deep as a well in the desert. A cold wind blew across the back of her neck and her wrists. The eye spoke not with words, but with the return of all that had been hidden from her memory. Like birds finding the right north. Neferu suddenly remembered a distant afternoon, when she was a child, standing in a damp brick courtyard, listening to the rain, and hearing a voice calling from inside the house, "Come in." She could not remember the face, only the gap between the call and her footsteps, the gap suddenly filled with light. The eye gave her the feeling that all her loss was still there in another form. Meru sniffed, his calloused hands shaking slightly. He looked at the men carrying the chests, standing like statues of salt. "We carry words out of here," he said. "But words have no form, no one can carry them." He smiled, and his smile was like the sound of pebbles on pebbles. "So I will carry things that have form." They lifted the Ankh from the prow, wound the Uroboros' light into a small, criss-crossed bamboo frame, and placed the ivory carved with the Eye of Horus in the center of the frame like a seedling in the ground. When they were done, the silent boat fell silent to stone, the false stars on the dome extinguished like hungry fireflies. The stone door opened once more, then closed behind them. As gently as 2 hands placing a blanket over a sleeping man, outside, it was not yet dawn, but the east was less dark. A thin moon lay still like a sailless boat. They lit a fire. The flame was bluer than usual, burning straight up like some strange grass. Meru threw a little black incense into the fire, and the incense changed the voice of the wind. The wind became round, as if running through a jar. "There is much more to know," Meru said to Neferu. "These 3 marks are 3 paths, and each path forks into 7. None of them stands still." "Then begin where the path tells itself," she replied, her eyes never leaving the horizontal moon. He nodded, and took from the chest a roll of yellow paper as thin as a butterfly's wing. On it were written lines like roots. He did not read, but patted it as if patting a familiar animal. In the old days, when people still spoke the parent words of speech, there was a potter who made breathing pots. Each pot had a long neck with a ring-shaped handle, the Ankh. "The pot," he said, "needs a door to enter it." Once he made a pot as big as a child. He put an iron ring around the neck, and on the ring he carved a snake eating its tail to keep the air from escaping. When the pot was finished, he took it to the lake and set it down. The pot did not sink, nor did it float, but stood in the water like a man standing between two questions. That night he saw an eye open in the lake, looking up at him. The eye did not frighten him, it only asked him a question, which he forgot immediately. In the morning the pot broke, but the lake remained a circle of water that did not dissolve for many days. Is the potter still alive? Neferu asked. He died like all potters, his hands are still covered with dirt. But the story he left behind spins like a snake. Neferu bent down and drew a line in the sand with the end of a stick. She drew an Ankh through a circle, and from the circle an eye opened. If we follow this order, she said, the exit of the breath goes to the hand of the circle keeps the breath from escaping. The eye watches so that passers-by do not mistake the door. She paused, looking up at Meru. But if the order is reversed? The eye opens first, and sees what it does not want to see, Meru replied. Having seen, it gets tired, it calls the snake to close a boundary, then it calls the Ankh to invite the breath back in. Some nights it is this way, some days it is that way. The wisdom of a man of his word is to know the order. The fire turned amber. The scent was thin as onion skin, layered in the air. The caravan lay down like punctuation marks. Neferu did not sleep. She heard the night lengthen like a braided rope. Somewhere, a fox chuckled. And in her mind, the three marks became three characters, a woman with a key, a snake that was neither hungry nor full, an eye that did not blink. They did not speak, they just walked together on a dustless road. The morning was dim. The desert was pale, like paper that had been written on and half erased. They rose, packed the fire in ashes, loaded the trunks onto camels, and headed east where the black pillars were like giant letters written on the horizon. Meru walked beside Neferu. He tells a story without a beginning. There was a city where every house had two doors. The first door opened into the street. The second door opened into a tiny room, just enough room for a person to stand and a lamp. There was a small hole in the room that looked out into the sky. Every evening, the people in the house went in and stood still. They called the room the Eye Room. One day, the people forgot to open the door to the room, and the sky did not return to the city for 3 nights. When they remembered and opened the door, a child looked through the small hole and saw a large circle of light hanging right above the roof of the house, Uroboros made of fire. From then on, no one dared to forget to open the Eye Room again. Neferu listened and did not ask. They walked for a long time until the white light dimmed their eyes. At noon, they came to an oasis where water gushed from the ground like laughter. There was an old house on the shore, its door closed with a broken wooden bar. Neferu pushed the door open. The room was as cool as a heart when it had just heard an oath. There were 3 marks carved on the wall, worn but still vigorous. On the floor was a jute cloth, with a round ceramic eye in the middle. She picked it up, it was as heavy as a question. The house of the grain watcher, Meru said. They watched the ebb and flow of the water to write the calendar of the seasons. Whoever knows the calendar knows when to plow, when to sow, when to wait. They use the Eye of Horus to watch the sky, the Uroboros to remember the seasons, the Ankh to call breath into the grain. When the grain watcher grows old, they give the ceramic to a child with a still hand. If the city forgets the eye room, the oasis will remind them. Neferu replaced the pottery, but first she kissed the eye. Not a ritual, just a gesture of gratitude for having been seen. The scent of water and palm leaves mixed together, fragrant like soft incense. She went outside, sat at the edge of the shade, her feet ankle-deep in the water. Under the water, small fish swam like commas. She scooped up the water, letting it run through her fingers. Thinking that if ever she lost all names, the water would still call her in some other way. In the afternoon, the group continued on. The sun tilted as if hanging by a thread. In front, the black stone pillars gradually appeared in the shape of gates, the wind gate, the dust gate, the gate of a word that cannot be heard anymore. As they approached, they saw a man sitting at the foot of the gate, dressed in a white-brown shirt, his face neither old nor young. He lifted a broken vase and brought it to his lips. When he saw them, he stood up, put the vase down, and spoke in a voice that bore no trace of place, "Do you carry your breath far away?" Meru replied, "We only carry our voices. The breath stays with the living." He smiled, his eyes directed at no one, as if looking into the middle of everyone. Voices are also breath, just breath for nights when you don't want to sleep. He pointed to the gate, "Go through here, each of you will see a room without furniture, only light pouring down from the ceiling like standing rain. In the room, if you stand between your own feet, you will hear your true name. But be careful, that name is not used to call. It is only used to avoid being called wrongly." Neferu looked at Meru. He nodded. They entered one by one, each to a room. Neferu entered her own room, and as soon as her feet touched the threshold, she knew that all the stories from now on would be different from the previous ones. The light in the room did not polish anything, it only made everything appear as it was. Neferu stood between her feet. She did not think. She did not ask. She did not wait. She breathed, like a rope drawing water from a well, cool and heavy. And from somewhere, a sound touched her chest. It was not a letter. It was not a sound. It was a line. It went from the Ankh's girdle, around the body of Uroboros, and rested under the eyelid of the Eye of Horus. That line was her name. When Neferu stepped out, the sky stood still for a moment, as if waiting for someone to arrive. Everyone was silent, each holding something they did not have before, a rope, a stone, a trace of ash, a dry leaf. These things looked trivial, but the wind passed over them as carefully as if they were men at work. Meru signaled to go on. The man in brown and white picked up the broken pot, put it on his shoulder, and turned his back to the sand like a man returning home by a path only he knew. Night came swiftly, like a trapdoor, without making a sound. They set up camp near the last gate, the gate of the one word that cannot be heard anymore. They ate little, drank little, and kept much silence. Before sleeping, Meru sat alone, unrolling the yellow scroll again. He placed the Ankh on it, placed the Uroboros frame on top, and placed the Eye of Horus ivory to guard it. He closed his eyes, his lips quivering like an untouched string. In his half-awake dream, he saw a black sea with stars like salt sprinkled on it, and on the sea a sailless boat, the prow of which was an open eye. On the boat, a child held an ancient earthen pot, and in the pot there was the laughter of a potter. Neferu lay on her side, her ear to the ground. She heard the footsteps of those who had passed through this place before the stone was hard. She heard an unspoken promise between the three ancient marks and an unnamed day. Then sleep came, light as a wing of ash. And in that sleep, the three marks became three stars, placed exactly where they should be on her forehead, the Ankh in the middle, the Uroboros circling her head, the Eye of Horus over her right eye. An invisible hand rested lightly on her hair, then withdrew like a needle from a newly sewn cloth. The next morning, before the sun rose above the line of the stone pillar, Meru stood up. He spoke to the wind as if to an old friend, "We will go where stories are silenced, to bring forth the silence that tells itself." He looked at Neferu. She nodded, her hand on the Ankh as on the heart of a sleeping bird. They came to the gate of the one word no longer heard, where a series of symbols were carved into the beams, illegible but clear as a greeting. Beyond this gate, Meru said, everything will no longer be what it will be what it was, and what it will be. Neferu laughed softly, like someone hearing news she knew long before the words were spoken. She put her hand on the gate. It was cold as water under stone. She pushed, the gate moved with a very old sigh, not loud but deep, like a mountainside moving in the dark. The wind caught between the two slabs of stone suddenly stopped. Then flowed back, making the hairs on Neferu's neck stand up like grass in thunder. Beyond the gate was a long corridor with no ceiling, the walls standing like stone scrolls, on which the letters were in relief, some like the claw marks of a bird, some like someone had written with hair dipped in dew. The light from somewhere spread like water mixed with milk, just enough to see the road, not enough to see all the corners. They entered. Each step was like stepping on the surface of an old dream, soft and slightly sunken. Meru walked ahead, one hand hidden in his sleeve, the other lightly touching the Ankh, like someone who plays the rhythm to make a fleet of boats row together. The men carrying the chests breathed less heavily, because it seemed that breathing played a role here. It was a letter, and the letter that breathed more heavily would overwhelm the others. Halfway down the corridor, the left wall opened into a hidden pavilion, where round stone columns like tree trunks cut in half were placed. On each column was an object that was unusually ordinary, a wooden button, a rattan rope, a piece of black mirror, a pebble with a hole, a torn piece of cloth, a tile leaf. All were clean, all placed neatly like evidence in a case with no plaintiff and no judge. Neferu stopped before the black mirror. There was no face in the mirror, only a circle as hazy as steam. She did not touch, only tilted her head, and the circle in the mirror trembled like a pond welcoming the first raindrop. "This is a storehouse of silence," Meru said softly, her lips barely moving. "Each object is a story stripped of its words, leaving only its breath. To hear it, one must breathe with it." Neferu closed her eyes. She breathed slowly, not even knowing that she was breathing, just letting the breath come and go like a bird coming to rest and then flying away from an old house. The circle in the dark mirror suddenly lit up like a glancing fingernail. A voice without tone, neither old nor young, rose in her head, Once, someone was lost in a forest of words, walking forever without reaching the door because every word was a door, every word was a wall. He found a button that was not sewn into anything. He took it, and suddenly the forest of words shrank into a coat hanging on a nail. The lost man put on the coat, and the door opened by itself where the collar touched his skin. From then on, wherever he went, he carried a button that was not sewn into anything, so that if he got lost again, he would only have to remember, the door could be the collar. The circle of light went out. Neferu opened her eyes. She was neither sad nor happy, she was like someone who had just heard a secret message, not knowing when she would need it, only knowing that she would need it. She continued walking. Meru said no more, and the pavilion slid behind them like a stone rolling off the edge of a bed. The wall before them changed color, from gray to the color of sun-dried grain, then back to gray. A creak came from nowhere, went nowhere, just hovered like an outstretched arm that had not been grasped. They saw another archway, smaller, about the height of a man. At the top of the arch was carved a pupilless eye, like a frozen raindrop. Below the arch was a step, and on the step sat a gray earthenware pot, with a looped neck, an ankh, but the handle was broken, a hair-thin piece broken off. This gate invites only one person, Meru said, his hand still on the charm, his eyes flowing toward Neferu like water into a waiting pipe. If you enter, I will stand outside. But you will bring forth what no one else can carry. Neferu nodded, not thinking long. She stepped up the steps, bent down to pick up the jar. The jar was heavier than it suggested, as if it were wet earth, not air. She ran her fingers through the broken part of the handle, and the break closed like bark closing a cut. The pupilless eye at the top of the dome blinked ever so slightly, as if the entire dome had blinked. She entered. The inner chamber was long and narrow, like a flute, and light flowed through it like wine through a reed. With each step she took, the floor beneath her feet hummed a low note, audible not to her ears, but to her skin. On the walls, the drawings were no longer words, but lines running like underground water. Some tangled like dry roots, some straight as needles. The further she went, the lighter the jar in her hand became, as if she had understood something more, leaving a heavy handful of earth behind. At the end of the room, there were no walls. There was only a lip, and beyond the lip was a thick, honey-caked darkness, smelling of metal, and hearing the sound of drops falling as if on taut leather. Neferu set the jar down on the lip. She touched her breast, hearing the real name she had received the night before vibrate like a string when someone passed by and touched it lightly. From that darkness, a cold breath blew out, making the fine hairs on her arms stand up. It was not scary. It was like an old man passing through a door, leaving behind a faint scent of incense. I have come to give you a look. A voice neither outside nor inside spoke through her bones. This look shows neither more nor less. It is just right. Neferu did not answer. She waited. And the vision came, not as a sight, but as a feeling. The veins on the wall suddenly more, suddenly less, they gathered into 3 streams. The first stream curled and opened like a fetus stretching its shoulders, the second stream joined head to tail, rotating like a toothless wheel, the third stream was a black dot in a white circle, then the white circle became an eyelid, and the eyelid lifted. She heard the sound of a key falling into the right lock, making no sound, just a feeling of its right. "Take the pot away," the voice said, "because it's light." She lifted the pot. Yes, it was light as a tablecloth that smelled of the sun. She turned and walked through the flute room. The low note under her feet now changed to a warm note, like a small pot of boiling soup. The archway opened like someone's hand lifting a curtain. Meru stood still, his eyes as still as the mouth of a well that did not compete with the sky. Neferu handed him the pot. In the light they saw that the neck of the vase had healed, but there was a thread as thin as silk in the earth, a beautiful scar. "You have placed the eye where it should be," Meru said, his voice barely able to contain the slightest joy, like a spark hidden in the ashes. "Now for the ring." They left the vault and went deeper. The passage did not lead straight, it curved gently like the inside of a ring. The smell of damp stone mingled with the black scent of the day before to form a strange smell, the smell of something once forgotten and now remembered. On the wall, from somewhere unknown, a shadowy snake appeared, crawling parallel to them, its head forward, its tail trailing behind like a windswept scarf. It was neither afraid nor threatening, it walked as if it were the path itself. After a long while, for here time had to learn how to flow again, they came to a circular hall. The ceiling of the hall was a dome within a dome, like two eyelids one above the other. In the middle of the hall was a dark stone groove, a foot wide. The groove had notches, like a mortar marking different levels for the pestler to choose from. Beside the notch was a low stone bench, like the mouth of a tired mortar, the dead of words, Meru said. Whoever sits on the stone bench, puts his foot in the groove, and hears all the stories he has left off. Whoever can bear it, the loop closes. Whoever cannot, the loop opens, and he goes back the way he came. The chest-bearers retreated a half-step. Like receding waves. Neferu did not retreat. She placed the jug beside the bench, and sat down. The back of the bench was cool as morning dew against her shoulder blades. She put her bare foot in the groove, feeling the notches like steps touching the years inside her. Just as his toes touched the third step, a sound like the village gate closing softly rang out. The hall darkened a little, not because of the loss of light, but because another shadow had just arrived. The stories poured in, out of order, out of name, like night birds flying through the trees, flashing and then gone. The day she dropped a grain of rice into the brick crevice behind the house to see if it could find its way into the soil, the afternoon she threw a cheap ring into the small stream that ran around the oasis just to see how long the far sound was, the night she heard a low singing voice like someone singing to rocks, and she followed it halfway and turned back because she remembered she had left the fire out in the wind, a word she wanted to say to a man with eyes like summer windows, but it remained like a stranded fish in her throat. The time she wrote a name in the sand and quickly erased it with her heel, afraid that God would read it. As each story touched it, the groove glowed a notch, like a craftsman marking the place he had polished. Meru did not interfere. He placed his hand on the charm, his eyes looking down at his own toes. The men carrying the chests leaned forward, but did not breathe heavily. As the seventh story flowed like a short stream, the groove beneath Neferu's feet suddenly contracted, closing in a circle around her foot. At that moment, she heard a close in her bones, and an open in her heart. The contradiction was as sweet as a late ripening fruit. The shadow snake on the wall lifted its head, smiling in the way of the lipless, by drawing a little closer where it wanted to smile. It coiled, its head grasping its tail, and when its lips touched its tail, a small spark sprang forth like a spark from a rock. The spark flew up to the dome, touched its outer eyelid, and the whole hall winked softly. The groove opened, freeing the foot, but another, an invisible one, was placed around Neferu's hair, keeping the thoughts that wanted to leave from stopping and counting them before they left. "The ring remembers your name," Meru said, rising as if from a prayer. "Now there is breath." They left the hall and walked a little farther. It felt like they were entering a lower place, for their ears heard the sound of their own blood more clearly, and the smell of the earth became as heavy as the smell of wet cloth drying in a house. The passage led to a large chamber, but neither round nor square. It was shaped like a lung drawn by someone who had never seen a lung, only heard the breathing of a person far away through the wall. On the floor of the chamber, hundreds of tiny, round holes were made, as if someone had used a hot needle to poke the earth. From the holes, the air went in and out slowly. Like sand undulating in a thin wind, in the middle of the chamber was a stone table. On the table was a green bronze mold, the shape of a large ankh, with a handle the size of a palm. Beside the mold was a wooden hammer with a handle wrapped in hemp, shiny from being touched, and a basin of water that was as cloudy as a recently stirred field. In addition, there was a bellows furnace, standing ready, like a whale asleep on land. "Here," said Meru, "they cast the breath of metal, to teach the metal to remember how to soften. Whoever wishes, may place in the mold something that is hard within himself, and pour hot breath into it, so that it may learn to change shape without losing itself." Neferu put her hand on the ankh. The metal was cold as a piece of darkness. She thought of a hard piece within herself. It came immediately, the words she had swallowed, the words that had turned to stone in the space between her neck and her chest. She did not want the words to be arrows, she wanted the words to be doors. She looked at Meru. He nodded, the eyes of one who had seen many doors open without being pushed by hands. She took the basin of water and poured it slowly around the mold, letting the water soak into the soil, making the soil remember its softness. She blew on the furnace. The fire was not high, but it burned steadily like someone who knew how to love. An ingot of metal, an unnamed alloy, was placed in the cauldron. It melted like a story that found its rhythm. Neferu lifted the cauldron and poured it into the ankh mold. The metal flowed in, bubbling like a child's laughter in the throat. When the mold was full, she waited. No one spoke. The breathing holes on the floor of the room regulated the air like a flute playing the same song. When the time came, Neferu lifted the mold. The newly cast ankh appeared. The color of the sunset on the cliff. She dipped it into the basin of water and heard a light hissing sound like a small fish touching hot oil. When she pulled the ankh out, she saw that on the handle, in addition to the natural contractions of the metal, there was a very shallow engraving, the shape of a half-open eye. No one had carved it, but the mark was there, like a habit of the universe that reveals itself when it passes through the right hand. Meru let out a soft sound that only the old understood, a sound of contentment that no one needed to know. He told the bearers to spread out the jute cloth. Neferu placed the new Ankh in the middle, on the left the old vase with its handle. On the right the bright bamboo frame of Uroboros. The three lay there like three brothers and sisters who had found each other after a long separation. The air in the chamber changed its tone, becoming deep and long, like a song coming from the wall. Now we hear the city under the city speak, Meru said. He placed his hand on the Ankh, the other on the Uroboros frame, his forehead tilted ever so slightly toward the ivory piece of the Eye of Horus in Neferu's bag. Those who do not want to listen can sleep. No one slept. The chest-bearers, accustomed to carrying heavy things, suddenly found themselves carrying something lighter and more careful than any burden they had ever carried. They knelt around, hands on knees, eyes between their feet as if they had been told. The sound of the city did not come from the ground, nor from the vault. It came from between the forehead and nape of the neck, passing through the place where people tied their hair, untied an imaginary knot, and flowed. It spoke in images not to be seen, but to be placed in the right place in the listener. The streets were veins, the squares were lungs, the city gates were eyelids, the wells were pupils, the market was tongues. The docks were heels, the cathedral was the rib cage, the kitchen was the liver, the library was the nerve strip along the spine. The city had once breathed regularly, then one day the eyelids forgot to blink, the pupils dried up, the wells ran dry, the tongue talked too much, the heels stood too long, the rib cages did not beat, the nerve strip trembled like a wind-struck string, and all the doors opened into the wrong rooms. The people who lived there moved like gasps. Neferu placed her hand on her heart. She felt that there was a city within her. She placed guards at each gate, Ankh stood at the breast, Uroboros patrolled along her belly, the Eye of Horus climbed the tower of his forehead to watch the sky. She asked nothing but that these three never leave each other. The city continued to speak of a room in the center, the room without a name. There was an empty table, on which were placed three objects no one could name but that everyone knew their hands had touched, a key that opened no door in the house, a bracelet that fit no finger, an eye drawn in ash on a washed palm. Whoever entered the room and sat still long enough would recall a forgotten breath. When he exhaled it, the city changed its rhythm. Not much, not spectacular, not a drum. Just a rhythm, like a song coming to a chorus. We'll find that room, Meru said, his eyes neither wider nor narrower. And if we don't find it out there, we'll build it here, he pointed to his chest, and then we won't move it. Leaving it where it belongs. A footstep sounded at the entrance to the lungs. Not a human, not an animal. It was like a footstep, a slow question. A figure stepped out of the light at the edge of the door. It was the man in the brown and white robe from the front gate, the broken pitcher still on his shoulder. But now the pitcher was tied with a hemp rope, and where it was tied hung a small piece of copper engraved with an indecipherable mark, but one that everyone could feel, a closed circle. When the noise of the city reaches the ears of the people who keep the pulse, they know they must carry the water, the man said, his voice as quiet as someone speaking indoors when there is a storm outside. Can you hear what the well is saying? Meru nodded. The well thirsts for a wink. And the tongue thirsts for silence. Then I will teach the well to blink, said the man in white and brown, setting down the jar. He walked to the stone table, touched the warm Ankh. But you must teach the tongue to be silent. Neferu smiled faintly, like sand discovering a familiar footprint. She stood up, picked up the neck of the jar. The neck of the jar emitted a very low sound, like a word without having to speak loudly. She put the jar to her lips, not drinking, just letting the breath pass through the mouth of the jar, so that the jar could learn to speak without making a sound. The echo returned, a little fuller, like a room with a window to the north open. The man in white and brown was satisfied. He lifted the broken jar that had been tied, tapped it lightly on the body, and from it fell a drop of ink-black water. The drop fell into one of the hundreds of small holes in the floor. Immediately, the atmosphere changed, like a song changing from major to minor in an unnoticed note. The breathing holes received the drop as if it were receiving news. "Not much, let's go," he said. "The room without a name is not where the sign is. It's where the shadows of three things overlap without stepping on each other." They packed up their things, the newly cast Ankh, the Uroboros frame, the neck of the jar with the heeled handle. Neferu wore the Ankh on her chest. The metal bracelet felt cool against her skin like a moonbeam. The Uroboros frame was tied to her back like a carrying pole that carried nothing but was heavy to look at. The jar was wedged between two chests, and she shook it a few times to remember the rhythm. They left the lung chamber, the passage behind them closing with a faint ph sound, like someone blowing out a lamp but leaving the smell of oil in the air. The shadow snake walked beside them again. This time, it was slimmer, as if it had shed its skin somewhere in its lungs, leaving a thin layer of translucent skin clinging to the wall. It touched its tail to its head more often, like someone checking to see if a button was buttoned properly. The corridor led them to a well. It was not a round well, it was a gourd, an eyelid. The edge of the well was smooth stone, and in the middle of the water there was a quiet vibration, as if someone had blinked in the water. The man in the brown and white robes sat down at the edge of the well, placed the broken pitcher beside him, and held out his palms. On one palm was a circle drawn in ash, on the other an open parenthesis as thin as a child's fingernail. "I show the water how to remember," he said. "But you are the ones who must show the water how to forget." "Forget what?" a man carrying a chest asked unconsciously, for the question slipped out like a grain of rice through a finger. "Forgetting the calls that are not your name," the brown and white man replied, looking into the water. "Water is easy to hear, so it gets tired easily. You put an eye in the water and a circle on the shore. The eye to see that at noon there is still night at the bottom. The circle so that whoever passes through will remember to return." Neferu nodded. She took the Eye of Horus ivory from her bag and placed it on the water's surface. It did not sink. It lay like a small boat, its pupil looking straight down to the silent bottom. Meru held the Uroboros frame over the mouth of the well, keeping its shadow in a thin orbit on the water. The brown and white man bent down, blew a breath into the broken flask, and then dropped a second drop of black water between the eye and the shadow. The drop did not spread. It stood like a sesame seed on a piece of cake. The well water flashed. This time, everyone saw it. A cloud shadow passed below, though there were no clouds above. The pupil of the eye fluttered, then remained still. The shadow tightened, like the arms of someone who had just learned a child's name. "Now we go up," Meru said, his voice different, like someone who had been thirsty for days after drinking water. "Up above is the city that forgot to flash. Make it remember." The path up was not long, but steep, and the rocks were sweaty like the brows of people working in the fields. Each step was a story that lifted their heels. When they emerged from the cave mouth, the sky was a blue drum that had just struck a loud note. The desert opened up. Dazzlingly white, but that whiteness was no longer a meaningless sheet, it was a page waiting for a short sentence. The wind carried the scent of food cooked in the storehouse, far away. On the horizon, the black stone pillars like the letters scribbled last night, were rounder now, less fierce. They walked toward what they knew was the city, though they could not see it yet. The brown and white man walked ahead, his shoulders slightly tilted by the vase, but his steps were steady, as if following the beat of a song without instruments. Neferu walked in the middle. At her chest, the newly cast Ankh trembled softly as her heart changed letters. The Uroboros behind her reflected light into the sky, making a migratory bird mistake it for a lake, swooping down and then flying back up, like a story that tried to name itself and then stopped. Afternoon. From afar, the city walls appeared like stitches on the edge of a night cloth. The city gate was open, but there was no one guarding it, only the wind chimes hung loosely, vibrating against each other, creating a whisper of broken words. In the city, the houses were still there, the roads were still there, the market still had stalls, the well still had buckets, the lamps still had wicks, but everything seemed to have just woken up from a sleep in which too much had been said. In the square, a group of people stood, each holding a strange object in their hands. Some held a handful of ashes, some held a bottomless spoon, some held a stringless lute, some held a piece of mirror. And everyone seemed to be a different person. They looked at the group of people as if they were looking at clouds. No one asked. The man in white and brown put the vase down in the middle of the square. Meru placed the Uroboros frame on the mouth of the city's great well. Neferu stood before the wind chimes, running her hand over them. The chimes fell silent. Not because they were forbidden, but because they heard the silence and were there to share. "We don't cure," Meru said, to no one in particular, but the whole city heard. "We just remind." Neferu lifted the Ankh, placing the ring over the well's lid. The metal ring set in stone made a sound that made the floating dust decide to fall. The brown and white man opened the broken lid of the jar, tipping the last drop of black water into the well. The Uroboros frame cast a circular shadow, and the bucket slowly lowered like a lowered eyelid. When the bucket touched the water, the whole city blinked. Just once. But enough. The wind chimes stopped ringing. Then they all rang out, not loudly. Another beat. The man with the stringless lute put his hand in the air, and there was a sound. The man with the bottomless spoon scooped the air, and there was the smell of new bread. The man with the mirror saw himself for the first time, and it was not strange. The man with the ashes opened his palm. The ashes were still ashes, but his hand was no longer cold. Neferu looked around. Among the inhabitants, she saw faces not old, not young, like the faces in the light room that day. A child ran up to her, looked up, his eyes as big as two dewy seeds. He did not speak. She did not speak either. She only placed the Ankh on his forehead. Very lightly, and lifted it away. On the forehead, there was a cool trace like the path of a raindrop. The child blinked, and in the well, the water blinked, as if greeting each other. The night fell without falling, it came like an invited friend. On the roofs, people retiled the bricks, opened the eye rooms that had long been forgotten. From those rooms, the sound of breathing rose up like fine incense. Each house placed a small circle of hemp rope in front of the door, so that the feet of those who remembered would tie themselves to the path back. On the city gate, people hung a piece of jute cloth. In the middle of the cloth was an eye sewn in gray thread, not elaborate, just enough to remember. When the night fire was lit, Meru and the others were invited to sit near the well. The man in brown and white sat opposite, the jar beside him like an animal that had been fed, becoming gentle again. The old man in the city, his hair as white as salt, stepped out, holding an ancient earthen jar, a brother to their jar, and said a sentence to open the meal. Every time the city forgets, the desert remembers. This time, someone remembers the desert. They ate, drank, and listened to the new person telling stories as if they were old stories. No one asked where did you come from or where are you going. The question of the night was a wordless one, are you breathing? And each person, in his own way, answered, by placing his hand on the pulse, by looking at the well, by blinking at the right moment. When the moon rose to eye level, Neferu left the fire and walked around the city. She passed houses with eye rooms that had just opened, through doors with thorny ropes, past porches hung with dry, fragrant leaves like good memories. She stopped at a corner where a child's handprint had been imprinted in the plaster, faint, but the scent remained. She placed the Ankh on it. In a moment she saw a path leading out of the gate, into the desert, unmarked. It was not for anyone else, it was for her, as her name called her to continue. Back at the well, Meru looked at her as if he knew the story. He handed her the Uroboros. Wear this tonight, he said. It will watch over you. And you? Neferu asked. I sleep beneath the sound of the well. The eye will watch over me. The night passed like a sailless boat that knew its way. The wind was as gentle as a hand, passing over the roofs, through the hair of the sleeping people, through the wind chimes without making them forget the new song. Before the roosters thought to crow, Neferu was awake. She took the frame off her shoulders, thanked the ring with a tiny bow, and put it away in the chest. The surface of the well was as smooth as the forehead of a person whose fever had just subsided. The city had entered the rhythm of one who was born to do the work he was born to do. I must go, said the man in brown and white, when the sun had just risen a finger above the edge of the wall. Another vein waits. Water does not stand still. Meru nodded. We will go too. The desert holds many stories that are forced to silence. The old man of the city brought a scented leather bag, inside which were 3 small objects, a wooden button unstitched, a pebble with a hole, a piece of black mirror. Take it, he said. When you are lost in the sound, remember to look at things that do not belong anywhere. Neferu took it, placing it in her pocket beside the Eye of Horus ivory. She looked around again. Children were running around the well, their feet as soft as the poem she had just thought. Women were opening windows, setting vases out to catch the light. Men were adjusting the strings of wind chimes to the right distance. A cat was walking across the courtyard, its tail drawing a lazy question mark in the dust. They were out the gate, the sand was sand again, the wind was wind again, but not as it had been yesterday. Beneath the sand, a nameless stream was slowly changing direction. Overhead, a bird flew toward the black stone where the writing was written, and the writing was no longer a threat, it was an invitation. "Where are we going?" asked one of the chest bearers, not because he needed to know, but because the question wanted to come out like a drop of water wanting to fall. "To the place where the snake's coil is tired," Meru replied. "To the place where the path breaks. There, we join it not with our hands, but by naming the tail to the head." Neferu lifted her eyes. In the distance, the horizon was like a new thread threaded through the eye of an old needle. She put her hand on the Ankh. It warmed the way metal learns to soften. She breathed, and the breath went out like a story that had begun in the right place. They walked, shadows falling on the sand in long, promised shapes. Noon would come. Evening would come, night would come, and each time, a small door opened/closed inside them. The desert did not ask. The desert listened. And somewhere ahead, where the coil forgot its tail, where the path forgot to turn, the three tracks waited, like three friends walking ahead in a leafless forest. The dawn that day was as thin as a mist, but in the mist there was already the scent of a long day. On the sand, the silhouettes of people were linked together like a black thread stretching in the direction Meru had pointed the night before. Neferu followed him, her steps silent as if she were reciting a long sentence. In her hand, the newly cast Ankh still warm from the night, and the Uroboros frame tied to the chest swayed in the morning breeze. The desert here was different. The sand was not gold, but dull silver like ancient coins buried long ago. In the sun, each grain shone like the eyes of those who had died but had not left. In the distance, a large crack ran long, like a slash on the back of a giant beast. That place, Meru said, was the broken road. In the middle of the crack, the snake's circle was tired, its head no longer reaching its tail, and the world there began to forget how to be round. As they drew near, the wind stopped, as if it had stopped breathing to listen. The edge of the crevice was black stone, rough as dried snake scales. Looking down, all he saw was a deep darkness, not knowing how deep it went. Meru knelt down and put his ear to the edge. He did not hear the sound of the earth, but a broken laugh, like a story interrupted and forgotten for hundreds of years. "The ring sleeps here," he said softly. "But its sleep is not continuous." Neferu sat down beside him. She unhooked the Ankh from around her neck and placed the bracelet against the edge of the stone. The metal vibrated slightly, like a newly tuned string. A cold air rose from the bottom, wrapping around the amulet and her hand. There was a smell of ash and dry resin in the air, and a thin sound like sand running through the fingers. "I have not yet reached the beginning." That was the sound of the ring. No longer round, it kept moving forward, forgetting that its tail was only a turn away from its head. Do you remember the name of the tail? Neferu asked, not in words, but as a thought placed in the Ankh. The breath paused. A silence as long as the shadow of a mountain. Then the voice answered, the name has changed many times. The last time I called it Shadow of the Day. In the distance, the gate they had passed through had disappeared. Only a new path remained, stretching into the pale light of the unnamed dawn. They began to walk down the new path, the light as thin as the morning smoke on the sand. No one said a word. All three seemed to know that if they spoke now, the sound would shatter the silence that lingered beyond the gate. The fusion object lay in Neferu's hand, small but emitting its own rhythm, light and sure as the heartbeat of a sleeping child. With each step she took, the sand beneath her feet trembled slightly, as if the desert had recognized something that had just returned to it. Meru walked beside her, the Uroboros frame on her shoulder no longer spinning, but silver still glimmering along the curve. The man in white and brown was quieter than usual, his hand holding the broken flask tightly. Now only the scent of ancient water lingered in the flask's heart. After many days, they reached a low mountain range. The path led to a closed valley, where the wind could enter but not escape. In the center of the valley rose a large boulder, as flat as a tabletop, carved with countless overlapping lines, symbols older than any they had ever seen. Each line was a fragment of a story, and all of them twisted into an unfinished spiral. Meru placed his hand on the boulder, closing his eyes as if listening. Here, he said, is where stories are bound to silence. If this thing is placed here, it will not be hidden, nor will it be possessed. It will wait until the world needs to hear it again. Neferu stepped forward, holding the fusion in both hands. Its light touched the symbols on the stone, and the carvings began to vibrate, like strings that had not been plucked in a long time. A warm current spread from her palms to the stone, then seeped into the valley. The brown-white robed man poured a final drop from the broken flask to the base of the rock. The drop disappeared immediately, but a circle of moisture spread out, enclosing the entire symbol. Neferu placed the fusion in the center of the circle. As it touched the stone, a deep, deep sound filled the entire valley, not loud, but enough to stop every living thing in the vicinity. The sound traveled not only through the air, but through bones, through memories, through things that had never been said. The fusion sank into the stone, its light fading like the sun setting behind distant mountains. When it had completely disappeared, only a faint trace remained on the rock, a circle encircling a cross with a handle, a snake around the handle, and a half-closed eye in the center. Meru looked at Neferu, smiling like someone who has finally seen a seed take root. It belongs here now. And when it needs us, it will call to us. Or someone else. They left the valley as dusk fell, the red light covering their backs like a thin cloak. No one looked back, not because they had forgotten, but because they knew that the story had never truly left them. On their way out of the mountain, the wind changed direction slightly. In its sound, Neferu heard 3 syllables in no language she knew, but she understood the meaning: we remember. And so they continued on, carrying no treasure with them, but carrying a new beat in their hearts, the beat of the world when form and name find each other again. Many seasons passed, the sand changed color, the wind changed direction, and the paths that had marked their footsteps were swallowed by time. But that hidden valley remained there, as silent as a waiting breath, on full moon nights, when the silver light fell deep enough to touch the rock, the faint mark on the rock's surface suddenly lit up, dimly like the moon shining through the mist. The circle, the cross with a handle, the snake with a closed tail, and the half-closed eye became clear, then gradually trembled gently. The goatherd, the traveler, or the lost who happened to come there that night, would hear a deep sound from the heart of the rock, like an ancient call drifting through their sleep. The next morning, they often forgot what they heard, but still carried in their hearts a strange feeling, that there was an untold story somewhere between their heartbeats. Far away, Neferu, Meru, and the brown-white man still traveled through many other lands. They grew older, their hair changed color, their hands became more cracked, but in their eyes there was still a quiet light, the light of one who had seen where the shape and the name were born together. One morning, when the dew still lingered on the mountain shoulders, a child who had never learned to read suddenly drew in the sand a circle embracing a cross with a handle. Around the handle was a snake, and in the center was an open eye. He did not know why he drew it, only that his hand found its way, and when the shape was completed, in a faraway place where no one could see, the closed valley trembled slightly. A deep sound echoed again, long and deep like the memory of the earth. The story did not end. It only went further, waiting for the day when someone else heard that rhythm and embarked on his own journey,